aspirations only for the things that we want? Because I have aspirations for many things that I don't want. I don't want to be in an abusive relationship. I don't want to lose my right to choose what I am or what I'm not comfortable with, regardless of how someone else perceives it. I don't want to be a doctor. Why? I remember the first time I learned what death was. It was the death of a friend's father, and I was about 10 or 12. And I'd asked my friend, "Were you there? What did death look like?" And she said, "No, I wasn't. Dr. Uncle and a nurse were there." And I remember then thinking that I don't want to be in a profession where you are made to sit with death in the room. This is Sonali Acharji, and you are listening to Health Wealth, a podcast that wants to get to the heart and reality of human well being, something which is incredibly subjective because what constitutes and contributes to our well being, it changes with your genetics, your gender, your geography, your age, your self identity, and even your profession. The streets are flooded today, and not just with dirty drain water. They're flooded with the pain of all those who look after our health and well being. It's surprising how unhappy our healthcare workers are in some parts of the country, and how it takes an incredibly horrifying incident for us to even notice it. I'm not sure what it would take for us to do more than just notice it. Right now, most responses are still limited to vague promises, the odd guideline, and increasing security by 25%. But what if the security is already, that's already there is one of those companies where the guards just sit in a chair and look at the phone all day? Increasing that by 25% is going to do no more than just hog up a lot more of your internet bandwidth. Meanwhile, those who have to be inside hospitals and live a very, very similar routine as the one that the young doctor who was murdered and raped brutally in Kolkata went through, they have no choice but to seek solace and strength from one another. I'll share four very, very short stories, but they really left a mark on me that I collected when I was meeting healthcare workers on the protests that happened over the last few weeks. There was a female doctor who shared how she'd been molested twice by attendants of patients. And she went to her hospital medical superintendent, and they refused to file an institutional FIR, which is actually mandated by law. There was a male nurse who told me that there was this one time he had to work 42 hours because the nurse who had to come to relieve him was late and they were short staffed that night. So he just stayed on. He came back and then returned to work within 5 hours. So it was 4 days of just endless working, standing, collecting things. It's not like, he goes to work and he sits down. He said, I had back pain for weeks after that, and I still wasn't allowed to take a break. There was a male radiologist who told me that once he went to a woman patient and said, I need to attach these cords to your chest. And her husband heard it and walked in and punched him. There was a female paramedic who worked with an ambulance company who said she once asked her employers that, look, it's not safe for me to go to public toilets at night when there are emergencies. So can you provide security? And they said, why don't you quit? It's too much for us to take care of you. And I just want to also very quickly mention that even as we're all discussing, what's happening with healthcare workers and how terrible the incident in Kolkata was, even as we're saying these words, in the second week of August, a female nurse was raped in a hospital in Moradabad in Uttar Pradesh. So this episode is dedicated towards a better understanding of healthcare workers' health. I feel we really do not properly understand their world. And no solution can ever be found if you don't know what the problem is and what the consequences of that problem is. Yes, we know doctors are busy, and we know they work hard, and we know they're in difficult conditions. But what is busy? How hard do they work, and what on earth are these difficult conditions really? And put together, how does the threat to safety and the high stress nature of the work they do, how does these two things combined together play out in the minds and the bodies of our medical professionals? This is something I'm really hoping we'd be able to understand today. And to help us do so, we have with us someone who was once a medical student himself at Kasturba Medical College in Manipal. Dr. Mohammad Fahad Khan is now one of the top nephrologists in Bangalore, and he works with Manipal Hospital, which is on the old airport road in the city. Hello, sir. How are you?
Hi, good afternoon. I'm doing well. How about you?
I'm very good. When I'm saying Old Airport Road, I remember when I was in Bangalore for a brief period, and there was an Anand Sweets there. Um, and I
It's still
remember,
there. Yeah.
yeah, and I
Yeah.
remember we used to have nariyal barfi, coconut barfi, and stand on the road. And actually, you could see Manipal Hospital. You could see people, the movement and the frenzy happening as you walk down that road. And I'd always look in and be like, God, you can feel the stress. Why would someone work there? So please tell me, why do you work there? Why are you a doctor?
There's no backstory behind it. It is primarily the passion for the subject. I think through school, I was drawn towards biology. And one is always fascinated by the human body and the complexities of health and disease. So, since the age of maybe ninth standard or so, I think once we had biology, and fortunately, the teacher who was teaching us biology was also, she uh, made us very curious about the subject. And I guess that's where it all started. And subsequently, one thing led to the other, and here we are.
And why nephrology?
Nephrology was primarily during our master's training, my MD training at Kasturba Medical College. My mentor, Dr. Vasudev, and the nephrology head of department, Dr. Ravindra Prabhu, they were great teachers. They are great teachers, rather. And they managed to create this interest in nephrology. It's a mix of emergencies, mix of outpatient care. It always keeps you thinking, always on your toes. And as my boss, Dr. Balal, says, there is never a dull day in nephrology. So I guess that's why.
And so you said you have a love for biology, and you're very genuinely interested in the subject, but the intra and interpersonal aspects of being a doctor, the stress of being a doctor, the long hours, the sheer amount of, I mean, actually, I really don't know fully how much you guys study, but I have seen some books and they look terrifying. Did that take you by surprise?
The training, you mean?
Yes.
No,
All the years.
we all know and understand what we are getting into. Obviously, it varies from institute to institute. It also depends on how your colleagues and mentors are, and it also depends on how many colleagues you are. So, the more number of seats per year, the work gets divided amongst those many number of individuals. That would decide the number of night duties you have. But overall, I guess the amount of hours that one needs to put in more or less remains the same across the country. Uh,
Right.
so,
And what were night duties like? How did you cope? As a resident, you must have gone through, what all residents today are complaining
yes.
about. How did you cope with your night duties?
I mean, there is something calming about the hospital at night. And if you
Wow.
do, God forbid, you
Yeah.
have to be in a hospital at night, you would understand what I'm trying to say. And when you take up the course, you do realize that yes, you are expected to do night duties. So, it would be foolish to walk into the course and expect anything less. However, having said that, there are certain challenges, and contrary to our peers in the United States, our colleagues in UK and Australia, where the system is a little different, the Indian system is more rigorous and grueling that way. I mean, you are challenged with sleep deprivation primarily.
Mm.
So, as uh, a day would start, for example, at 8 a.m., and if it's your duty that night, you would end up working till 8 p.m. the next day, which would constitute an altogether duty of 36 hours.
Mm.
And that night, depending on the specialty you're in, most specialties, at least which require night duty, you wouldn't have slept very well. So to function optimally the next day, that becomes a challenge. You would have binged on a lot of coffee through the night and subsequently the next morning. And mood disturbances can creep in. You tend to be a little more frustrated, on the edge the next morning when you're sleep deprived. So, those would be the challenges that come up with night duty. And as you started off saying that every doctor should treat their patient as the first patient that they're seeing, the 36-hour duty sometimes may not allow you to do so because you're mentally fatigued. Apart from being physically fatigued, the next morning you would be mentally fatigued. And as I told you previously, it was this surgeon William Halsted back in the days from John Hopkins who uh, was a drug addict, and he coined this term resident and residency, and he introduced this concept of 36 hours duties or longer. And while the West has moved away from that concept and limited the number of hours for each resident, the same hasn't happened in India yet. It's taken for granted that a
Mm.
resident would work for 36 hours. And I'm sure there is a way to make this more flexible, schedule the shifts in a way which is favorable for the resident as well as the patients. Because at the end of the day, it's not just the resident who is suffering with the 36-hour duty. With certain errors in judgment, the patient could also be at risk. And every patient deserves to be seen by a doctor who is functioning optimally and at their best, both physically and mentally, I feel.
Yeah. And, one of the things that I'm hearing as you say this is you have actually given your health for the health of others. If you're not getting proper sleep and you're binging on coffee and you're exhausted and stressed, you're sacrificing your own health in some ways to make sure others are fine, which is extremely commendable in that sense. You've also given your patients your cognition to some extent because every time I meet a resident, I like to ask them, what's the hardest thing you've learned this year? And one resident told me we had to memorize all the bones. And that's when I realized that there are 206 bones and with strange names. I couldn't even pronounce them. I've written them down just so, the listeners get a sense of these names. But inferior nasal concha, ethmoid bone, maxillae. I don't know how on earth you remember 206 like this. But tell me what in your course and in your curriculum was the hardest for you to learn, to remember?
I mean, the process of learning still continues, obviously, and as cliche as that may sound, actually, to be honest, the theory part is quite easy to remember, especially if you've read it multiple times. But it's sometimes what you've
Yeah,
read which
yeah,
can be hidden in plain sight if you don't know how to apply what you've read. So
right.
you may have read a very unique syndrome and you can list out all its clinical features, but you could have the same patient in your outpatient the next day and you would completely miss it. So it all depends on who your trainers are, your teachers are, your institute, and the amount of time you spend with your patient. Sitting behind a book is an easy thing to do. It's the clinical hours that you put in
Yeah,
that refines you. And
yeah.
as they say, about, as they say about wine, that as it ages, it becomes much
Mm.
better. The same applies to doctors, not because they read more with time, it's because they see more patients. And
Yeah.
I think that's what is probably the most difficult thing about the practice, where you know your theory, but if you fail to apply it, it becomes difficult. And I think the other most not difficult, but something which should be stressed upon in training is how to deal with people, how to communicate
Mm.
with them, how to empathize with them, and understand their emotions. So that's not something that is taught in books. That is something that you learn on the job, and you learn with experience. Sometimes you speak a certain way which wouldn't be appreciated by the patients or their attendees. And it's very important that you put yourself in their shoes, and understand their frustration, understand their anxiety, because this is a job for you which you do day in and day out, but it's their first time in the hospital.
Mhm.
And I mean, for all practical purposes, when a patient does come to the hospital, at least in our setup, it's more or less an emergency.
Yeah.
So it comes with a lot of frustration and anxiety, and it's very important that we understand that, and to be able to sit them down, communicate with them what the problem is, explain the plan of action. There are always, you know, you try to achieve a certain target within a certain time, but it's very important that residents and us doctors also subsequently take out those extra 5 minutes to tell the patient and their family what is exactly happening, because
Yeah.
unless they don't understand the illness, they will not agree or understand your plan of management and treatment.
Yeah. And actually, so I've been going to hospitals for emergencies from a very young age, 16, 17. I've had four grandparents, one father, one mother, two uncles, and an aunt who's had multiple hospitalizations. And when you enter as a patient, you have no idea who's a resident, who's a junior doctor, who's a specialist. You just see white coats. So you see a white coat, you want to grab that person and you're like, tell me what's happening. Give me, just, you have to say, is he surviving or not? And then they'll say, we need to run tests. I'm like, no, you have to tell me. And they're like, no, we need to get the tests. I can't tell you till we give the test. And then when they get the test, and they'll say, we have to wait to see how the medicines are working. And you're just so frustrated because it's like one of those things you just can't be patient, and you know what you're doing is wrong. You know you're pressurizing someone, bullying someone. Sometimes I can see that they're getting frustrated. And once I remember quite recently, in fact, I had a big argument with one of the junior doctors, and because the tests were taking too long to come. And I was just, it's an old person, a 70-year-old with diabetes, heart disease. You get very stressed out. And my mother actually. So, we were having this argument. And then when he managed to pacify me, he went and he sat with a colleague at this was the emergency room, and the colleague reached out and held his hand, and as if like, it's okay, I understand, I'm there. They were speaking a sort of silent language of support, and I see that replicated again now at the protest. So it is a bond, to work in the healthcare profession, isn't it?
Oh, yes, definitely. I mean, at least in response to the recent events, we healthcare workers did manage to come together. I mean, to advocate for our safety and for our rights. And that fostered a sense of community and solidarity. Unfortunately, I mean, through this whole episode, we also realized how ignored
Mm.
the voice is. And what was initially thought of as a problem for the medical community, I mean, that's absolutely wrong, because it's a problem for the community itself. I mean, just like how your lawyers and your police officers are the backbone of the society, the same applies to doctors too. And an issue of the doctors does become an issue for the community. And in this case, it's not even about doctors anymore.
Yeah.
It's about the safety of our mothers, sisters, and daughters, and just how we have failed as a society, and makes you question humanity as a whole. If
Yeah.
you see how we've behaved and what atrocities uh, the person in question had gone through. So, I mean, that
Yeah.
was quite disheartening, definitely.
How did it impact you? Because, and I asked this, that every doctor at some point or the other has seen incidents of violence take place around them in the hospital. I walked through a line of doctors at a protest. Every second person I was catching, I'm like, did this impact you? And they had a story that this has happened in front of me. And now it's making me question, am I safe? Girls, even men were also scared. They're like, we're scared to wear expensive watches, or when we're walking home and we have money in our wallet. It's not like, they are immune to crime and physical violence. Did that sort of fear or anxiety come into you also?
I mean, apart from the fear, the anxiety, the frustration, I mean, it's more of frustration, rather. And if you speak to any resident or doctor, male or female, at some point, all of us have been exposed to some sort of aggression from a patient or from a patient attendee, which in the moment we understand that it is probably out of their anxiety and frustration, and raising someone's voice up, you can understand that to a certain point, but getting violent,
Mm.
aggressive, abusive, to the point that you start hitting someone. And here in the case of Calcutta, it's absolutely absurd that you could,
Yeah.
I mean, as I mentioned, that just makes you question humanity.
Yeah.
It enrages you, because at the end of the day, all of us who have taken the Hippocratic Oath are just trying to do good, make a
Yeah.
difference in a patient's life and in their family's life. I'm sure everyone and all doctors come from a good place where the patient should be benefited, and them being better is our primary motive. Whether we are able to achieve that or not is different,
Yeah.
because the age old saying that doctors can play God doesn't really apply. There is no
Mm.
magic pill which will treat all illnesses or most illnesses. We do have to wait for the logistics where we run your tests. The runtime of any test would be a few hours. We have to wait for
Yes.
those reports. We have to wait for those scans. We have to wait for the radiologist to give us the reports of the scans that have been done.
Yeah.
So, however, it is during this waiting period where anxiety and frustration takes the better of families and patient attendees, and then things boil over and things could get aggressive. But that's when communication has to be completely open, and patients and their attendees, when they come to the hospital, also have to be understanding. Yes, there is an issue. The doctors have understood the issue, but to make the right decisions, they have to know what they are treating, and that is why we have all the tests that we have.
Yeah.
And subsequently, only after you have the reports are you going to be able to have a decent plan of action which is going to be appropriate for your patient.
Yeah.
So, I mean, to answer your question, yes, it creates fear, it creates anxiety, it creates anger and frustration, and makes you question the type of society that you're serving, and demotivates you also at times. I'm sure
Yeah.
the residents all over, and doctors alike, we feel demotivated that why is a society which we are trying to do good for, and we only want their well-being, physical as well as mental, is trying to attack us.
Yeah.
So
I should tell the next friend or family member who gets angry that that person is drinking a whole lot of coffee to keep you alive. No, but in a serious note, once I was at a huge multi-speciality private hospital, and because you mentioned the diagnostics and the imaging technicians, and actually sometimes we forget them. We forget the radiologists. And I remember there was a long queue outside the MRI scanner, and a couple of there was an old lady, and she was, I mean, she was physically able, but she was getting impatient, and so she went and she tapped and she said, "You're taking too long, and what's going on?" And so the guy came out. I thought this was such a smart thing to do. Instead of fighting with her, he came out and he held out one of the scans and he said, "I want you to stare at this point for the next 3 minutes." And we're all like, "Oh God, यहाँ पे तो we've been waiting for an hour. He's taking out 3 minutes to prove something." And she stared, and then he said, "Imagine doing this, just staring at points and trying to see the differences between them for hours. And if you get it wrong, you will be the reason that person is misdiagnosed and mistreated. And I have a migraine today. Can you please wait?" And I tell you, after that, we all had to. We actually, when he said, "I have a migraine," and you couldn't help it, then you saw the human behind, a worker. And then that's something we don't see. We really don't see the humanity when we are ill. We just want to get better.
Yeah, I mean, yes, as you said, I mean, the patients don't realize that so and so doctor has put in 12 hours or, 24 or 36 hours before they've been attended to. The doctors sometimes also need to empathize and understand that the patient has probably waited for hours together to be attended to. So it's, as I said, communication is key. Both
Mm.
parties need to understand where that individual is coming from.
Yeah.
And I mean, realistically speaking, many of the residents are overworked. They're now in, not now, but they've always been in unsafe working conditions. Added to that, inadequate compensation, which is an issue altogether.
Hmm.
And lack of support, lack of resources. Quaternary centers like ours, I mean, we are blessed to have everything that we want, but there are many residents who are in centers which don't have all the blood tests, all the scans that they would need, which again limits the way that they could take care of their patients. So, added to all this restrictions, if you have an angry patient or attendee, it's
Mm.
only going to enrage you further, demotivate you, and
Yeah,
frustrate.
yeah. From an institutional perspective, now that you've been a doctor for so long, you must have been noticing things. Something one resident had told me, who was working with the Apollo group, is that they do feel that institutional FIRs should be more common. That if every doctor has seen violence at least once, why are the FIRs for violence against healthcare workers? Why is the rate so low and the conviction rate even lower? That's something he had pointed out. But is there something that you feel, as a doctor, you would appreciate getting?
Yes, I mean, definitely. For example, if an officer on duty is attacked, a police officer, I
Mm.
mean, there are no questions asked,
Mhm.
you're imprisoned and you are given the adequate punishment. The same applies to any person in service, be it
Mhm.
any field, and more so in the field of medicine. So, as it was pointed out very rightly by your friend from Apollo, I think most hospitals now take this very seriously. I can
Mhm.
speak for our institution where violence against doctors is taken very seriously. And, at least if your institution gives it
Yeah.
importance, you know that you got the backing of the institution. You're
Mhm.
not alone on that night duty. You're not alone in that fight or whatever argument that has taken place. So it's very necessary that adequate response teams are there in the institution. FIRs are filed and adequate police action is taken. And I mean, the huge uproar across the country to implement the same across all centers is the need for the hour.
Yeah. If you only if you're comfortable, we can discuss something that I started off with, being in a room with death. The emotional, the psychological, the mental, all the non-physically visible aspects of being a doctor, particularly when you lose someone. I know a lot of doctors get very close to their patients and it's a personal loss. How do you cope with it? How do you deal with being around death and so much of pain all the time?
I mean, obviously, it's saddening, and however, you have to be realistic at the same time. And for poor choice of words, with time, you do get desensitized a little. And as much attached you are with your patient and family, it's very necessary that you are objective uh, through the whole process, as well as realistic through the process. I mean, it's important that you don't squash all hopes and optimism that the patient has. This I talk about in reference to terminal illnesses uh, and alike. But it's very necessary that you are communicative with the patient, you're open with them, you understand where they are coming from. And it's very necessary that you are empathetic about it. As I said, though you are desensitized with time, and though you may have a personal connect, you cannot let emotions get in the way. You have to be realistic but empathetic at the same time, because you need to understand that that patient that who we are talking about is an individual himself. He's a
Yeah.
family member to many, and the care that you ought to give to the patient, put yourself in their shoes, and what is the treatment that you would expect from your doctor. It's very important that you instill the same treatment to your patient. So I think that logic is how I would approach
Yeah.
uh, my patient care, to see them and treat them as if they are my own. However, being realistic at the same time and keeping all communications open. And however morbid death may sound, you have to be you have to give your patients a complete picture, and
Mm.
at all points, at least the core family, you need to be open to them about what are the realistic possibilities in the future.
Yeah. No, was your first loss harder? Um,
I mean, I was
was
very
it
young at that point.
very
I
young?
think
And that must have been how do you deal with it at that young an age?
it was
Just,
during
fresh
internship.
out of
I think
school.
this was
Yeah.
probably 10 years ago or so.
Mm.
I mean, I still remember the patient background quite vaguely. I
Mm.
was a little disturbed, or quite disturbed that day. But as I said, with time, you
It gets,
understand that this
yeah.
is the circle of life, and all you can do is attempt to do your best to help
Yeah.
the patient and to save them. At the end of the day, what's written in the stars has already been done by the Almighty. But what you should never shy away from is giving in your best, uh, and giving your patient the best opportunity. At any point, if you feel you are not adequate or good enough to take care of your patient, you should not hesitate to ask for help. Sometimes, some of us have ego issues where we don't seek help, but that's very important, where if you feel like with a patient you've hit a wall, and you need more ideas, always go out and ask for help. I think
Mm.
that's one of the characters that a doctor needs to build with time.
Yeah, there are some doctors or even healthcare workers who come from slightly weaker economic backgrounds. And then it's not just the matter of pride, but also terrible fear of job loss or even the little that's given. As you said, compensation is an issue, fear of income loss. Um, do you think the issue of compensation, we are thinking of it in terms of doctors earning, but actually it affects their work and, how willing they are to say, I can't do something.
I mean, yes, I mean, your question basically is with respect to
Compensation, yeah.
compensation.
Yeah.
Yes, I mean that's with respect to residents as well as doctors alike. Uh, for example, in Karnataka, until very recently, so fortunately there was a salary hike which was announced last week, and that's great news for everyone. But imagine a resident who's working for 3 years and probably doing a 36-hour duty on a 3-day basis or an alternate day basis. They've already smashed the 70 hour week target that has been set. So they finished that in like 4 days, right? 70 hours. And that individual over a month is being paid 40,000 in the first month, 45,000 in the second month, and 50,000 in the third month. That definitely, I guess, or I'm
Yeah.
sure it's inadequate. And you probably agree with
And
that.
what savings do you have then? I mean, you have nothing to fall
Yes,
back on. If
yes,
you have
especially in a city
loans
like
or,
Bangalore,
yeah,
where if you're staying independently, even if it's a one bedroom hall kitchen,
yeah, your
uh,
deposit itself is so high.
yes.
Yeah.
And added to that inadequate uh, compensation, there's no work-life balance. I mean, you've probably not seen your family in a while. You've not seen your spouse if you're married. You've not hung out with your friends in quite some time. So your mental health uh, goes for a toss. Whatever earnings you have, they're going in just basic roti kapda makan, and you don't have any other savings. So that definitely gets frustrating. So as we discussed before also, there's a discrepancy in the pay between the north and south. And
Mm.
now at least with this hike, that gap does get bridged a little. But amidst all this and amidst all this frustration, imagine if someone has to experience violence
Mm.
added to this, how frustrating and demotivating it can be.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
it's very important for the non-medico community to understand where the resident doctors come from.
yeah.
In
And I don't think
again,
we've ever thought of tipping doctors or nurses, maybe a nurse once in a while, but
I mean,
never thought of
I don't think
giving
any
extra.
resident expects
Yeah, but
this
I'm just,
also.
when you were saying this, it just
Yeah,
suddenly struck me. And I don't even think that, maybe once I baked some cookies for a doctor after my mom came out of the ventilator, but that was that was it. And then you never see them again.
I mean, we are
And
very low maintenance. As I said,
you
a
are,
simple, a simple thank
yes.
you or even some cookies
Yeah,
would
yeah, yeah, yeah.
go a
That
long
that
way.
person was very much surprised.
So,
But why? Yeah, actually, it's true. I don't think we ever go back and do much more than say thank you, and then we never see them again. And you
yeah.
basically given us the best years of your life.
Yeah,
Uh,
and I mean, it's not that it's a sacrifice. It's something
mm,
which every doctor has chosen to
yeah,
do. It's
but
by
there's no
choice.
appreciation for
Yeah,
it.
but I mean, the process of training is by choice.
Mm,
However, it doesn't necessarily need to be as gruesome as it is. It, as I mentioned before, there can be better scheduling of shifts. You could have the same number of people doing the same amount of work, but in a more optimal way, rather than having 36 hours, split it 12 hours and 12 hours, and make it easier for the institution, for the doctor, for the resident, and for the patients. So I think,
if you had to restart your life, would you be a doctor again?
oh yes,
Yeah.
definitely. I mean, no second thoughts about it. There is nothing more thrilling than solving um a case where you're stuck, and then you put your mind together with your seniors, with your colleagues, and you crack a case. It's like being a detective. There's nothing more satisfying than seeing a sick patient go home. There's nothing more satisfying again to see someone leave your OPD room, and as I said, just say a simple thank you. So no doubts about being a doctor again.
Yeah, no, I think I think I told you this when I asked you to come for the episode when I said that I've always wanted a doctor who can really bring out the feeling of being a doctor, what you go through, the process, the emotions, the how to deal with things that no other profession, maybe being in the defense or security might, but even then they're not responsible for someone else's life, and that must be so stressful. So thank you so much for everything you've shared. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It
Thank
was a
you.
pleasure speaking with you.
I'm going to end this episode simply by a few words that a family friend has written. Her name is Dhriti Mushti. She is studying her MD in psychiatry at DY Patil College in Pune. And she is a doctor. Just because she's doing psychiatry doesn't mean she didn't do her 5 years of medicine. And it's something she wrote after the incident in Kolkata, and it was so powerful. I said, if I can read this out, I don't need to say anything else. Once upon a time, in a land far away, a little girl dreamt of becoming a doctor one day. She studied and worked for that doctor before her name. Today, the entire country hangs its head in shame. A dream left shattered, a body left bare, stripped of all dignity for the world to stare. What was she doing so late at night? Asked the man in the comfort of his ignorance. Ask the patients she helped that night, may they forgive you your insolence. We carry on, we power through, we put on our white coats, we continue to serve you. You who questions what she did, where she went, and what she wore. She chose to be alone and rest her eyes. She knew what was in store. We scream and shout and beg for what's right. We pray to God that it's not one of us one night. And yet again, our cries fall on deaf ears. Our voice will be crushed. Yet again, our faith in humanity turns to dust. We see you, hiding behind your indifference as your eyes look away. And yet, here we are, Dr. XYZ. How can we help you today? It was a very moving note which she had shared with me, and I felt it was the apt thing to end this episode on. What did you think of this episode? And if you did go into the details of what happened to the doctor in Calcutta, how has it impacted you and what you think of healthcare workers? If you are comfortable sharing, I'd really like to know about your health experiences and thoughts on health worker safety. You can write to us at pods@indiatoday.com, or you can message us on 8588966996. We are also there on major social media channels. And till next week, I hope you stay safe. I hope you continue your search for happiness and soldier through all your sadness and look after yourself.